Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the Editors and Publishers podcast. Here at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute, I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of the Claremont Review Books and the American Mind. I am joined by our director of publications. I always screw up his title, his crossover title, Spencer Clavin, but also associate editor of the Claremont Review Books.
And Greenland czar of the American Mind.
And Greenland czar, yeah.
Yes.
We're kitting him out with some Eskimo gear, a dog sled, and a spear. And wishing him the best of luck.
Danish isn't that hard to learn, right?
And we're joined by Mike Szabo, managing editor of the American Mind. Well, we're not going to start with Greenland, although it's a red-hot topic right now with Trump at the World Economic Forum, causing trouble with some indignant Europeans. We'll get to that, but first we wanted to start with ICE again, or ICE-related anyway, and talk a little more generally about the left and its trajectory right now. But Don Lemon, as Tucker used to call him, was out and about in Minneapolis, and this protest group decided they were going to descend on this church on Sunday, because the church, maybe one of the pastors, I forget the precise details, they're not that important, the crux of why they were there, but they wanted to disrupt Sunday services in order to have their voices heard, because one of the pastors or one of the senior leadership of the church is apparently the field director for ICE or somehow associated with ICE. So it was an unruly semi-mob of the normal kind of liberal agitators, the crass, traveling, swearing white guy who looks a few shaves away from his last shower, and then the organizing woman who's a black sort of activist leader of sorts, works for some local NGO, making six figures, of course. And they wanted to cause some discomfort. And there was some video filmed by the scruffy white guy who had an F Trump family show. So I'm modifying it, an F Trump beanie on, and has generally been crass and vituperative in his denunciation of ICE. And the video was striking. I mean, the parishioners didn't want to have too much to do with it. You could tell a few of them maybe had some sympathies, some sort of liberal Protestant sympathies with the general thrust of the protesters, but more or less they harangued and terrorized the poor parishioners for the span of, 20 minutes or so before they left. Don Lemon was there documenting it. In his smug way, he said they were committing acts of journalism. This is a watchword for the modern journalistic left, so-called. And the organizer said, well, we show up somewhere. This is sort of a clandestine organization, somewhere they don't expect, and disrupt business as usual. And this led Don Lemon, after videotaping some of it and talking to some of them, to say the following, which was, so this is what the First Amendment is about: the freedom to protest. And I just want to reiterate the point I think I made last week, which is this is in fact not what the First Amendment is about, at least not insofar as you use the First Amendment as cover to go harass people in a semi-private space of worship, as opposed to petitioning your government or just assembling. So I would dispute Mr. Lemon's characterization of this. This is it's just another evolution of what's been going on in Minneapolis with the left, as we discussed last week, doing everything they can to disrupt federal law enforcement and to disrupt the lives of anyone that might be in favor of the enforcement of federal law and federal immigration law, which ICE is doing in Minneapolis. I wanted to take a quick tour across the left a little more broadly and get everyone's take on it. Also making headlines in recent days was the Virginia Democratic legislature. Abigail Spanberger was recently sworn in as the new governor, and they're off to the races in Virginia. They are doing, among other things, they're rolling back, or they've proposed anyway. We'll see how this winds through the legislature. But in good Democratic fashion, they wasted no time in enacting some pretty sweeping plans, or at least starting the process to enact some pretty sweeping legislative transformations in Virginia, including hiking taxes, taxing ammunition and firearms, I think by some 11% increase, rolling back or softening their three strikes law, especially various forms of robbery and even some armed robbery, ending mandatory minimums for rape, manslaughter, assaulting law enforcement, and repeat violent felonies, and possession of child pornography. They also want to basically make hand counting of ballots much more circumscribed than it is. So they want machine readable ballots to only be counted by scanner machines. And the proposed legislation, quote, prohibits such ballots from being counted by hand for any reason or purpose not specifically authorized by law. So they want to lock down that process. I let the listeners and watchers or viewers draw their own conclusions about the impetus behind that particular piece of legislation. And then it's almost two things that are both predictable but lamentable. One of which is the home-based childcare provider startup grants pilot program. And I just want to read the precise details of that and let people determine what they will about this. It seems to me, well, I'll share my conclusion about it in a minute. This is the legislation would establish the home-based childcare provider startup grants pilot program, whereby funds are provided to childcare aware of Virginia to work in conjunction with the public and private partners enumerated in the bill in order to expand the supply of licensed home-based childcare providers in the Commonwealth, promote the safety of licensed home-based childcare providers, and support access to childcare for working parents in the Commonwealth through providing for the award of grants to licensed and unlicensed home-based childcare providers in the Commonwealth in accordance with the requirements of the bill. Now, given the now quickly notorious but long-standing, now newly public and newly notorious expansion or uncovering of fraud in the Somali community and Somali daycare community in Minnesota, this is a telling addition from the Virginians. And then finally, with a little more race-based identity politics thrown in, the SWAM program, that is the Small Women-Owned and Minority-Owned Business Program, has designated that basically all government contracts to projects up to $100,000 should be awarded first come, first served to small women-owned and minority-owned businesses. So it's a lot of this seems to me to be good democratic patronage operation through legislation under the guise of otherwise good things like childcare and government contracts. So none of that should be that surprising. Also on the front, I learned from Julie Kelly on Twitter that it took a DC jury about 35 minutes in recent days of deliberation to find a homeless man not guilty for shining a laser pointer at Secret Service members' eyes and at Marine One. So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, in Minneapolis, we have a kind of neo-nullification state of affairs going on, with federal law enforcement being opposed at all turns and being subjected to an atmosphere of harassment, loud noise and whistles, obstruction, mild bouts of violence, and otherwise obstructive protesting. You have, and this DC jury thing is just a piece of the evidence across a lot of blue states and jurisdictions of a kind of slow-rolling jury nullification, especially for the areas of priority for the left on immigration and aggressive vagrancy and other stuff. Basically anything perceived to be anti-Trump administration or anti the GOP spirit of reform that seems to be sweeping some parts of the country going on. So it's a bit hyperbolic. Our friend Rusty Reno wrote a piece just, I think, today in First Things about from Little Rock to Minneapolis. That may be a little hyperbolic, but it doesn't seem too hyperbolic. The standing question is whether Trump is going to invoke the Insurrection Act to try to do something about Minneapolis. And this all comes out in what looks to be an unfavorable polling atmosphere for Trump on this issue, with a lot of people disapproving of at least the spectacle and what they've seen of ISIS conduct in Minneapolis, or the general spirit of deportation and federal law enforcement. So all of which leads me to wonder. We have actually a draft piece from one of our friends in the Midwest, which talks about the McGovern coalition back in the late 60s and early 70s, and how it seemed to be standing for lawlessness and leftism of various sorts, and lost epically to Richard Nixon in his reelection in 1972. So it took that coalition and the left quite a long time, that is the better part of 20 years, till Bill Clinton in 1992, to draw the proper lessons. And of course, the proper lessons and them being learned by the left predates Bill Clinton's election in 92, but it took them a while to figure out how to become a majority governing party again, and not one that would get wiped out. But it's a very different time in America here in 2026 than it was in 1972. So the McGovernorization of the party seems to be proceeding once again, although in the spirit and lineaments of 2026 rather than the late 60s and early 70s. And it remains to be seen whether this will lead the public to reject this sort of lawlessness and general leftist bent, high taxation, racialized identity politics, and sort of open borders, anti-immigration sentiment. I guess, and the final question is, what kind of time does Trump have, or what is he playing with? So does he have time for this impression of the lawless left to set in, and for the proper reaction to emerge in the midterms? I think I'm pretty skeptical. The other thing hanging over Trump is pretty bad polling numbers on the economy. A majority of voters think that he has not done enough to improve economic conditions. Now, Scott Bessent, who was, I think, a few weeks ago on the All In podcast, for those that are interested, I think I may have mentioned this in a previous podcast, seems optimistic that the first and second quarters of this calendar year will begin to bear fruit from some of the influx of revenue from tariff policy, and a more favorable, Bessent thinks, lending environment for managing the federal debt. And all of this will redound to the benefit of Americans, and they'll begin to appreciate the measures that the Trump administration and the Treasury Department have taken to make their lives more affordable and all the rest. And then finally, we've discussed it before, but we have this video of Renee Good being shot. And so the people on the left and center left and Never Trump right are hopeful that this is another George Floyd moment, and maybe this is the precipitating event that has led to this decline in polling for Trump on the immigration issue, which is his signature issue. So lots of controversy stalks the land, and it looks to be a pretty spicy 2026 shaping up for us. What do you guys think?
It's funny when you put it that way. It kind of makes me think that the midterms are going to be about which side is more unpleasant and distasteful when they take to the streets. Like, you've got the bad optics and negative politics of harsh ICE tactics, and then you've got the truly unpleasant means that the far left uses in its so-called disruptions that we were talking about with Kyle last week. And we've been talking about this on this show for some time, I think, that like there's low-hanging fruit on immigration. There's stuff that everyone basically agrees should be put a stop to, except for the most radical open borders extremists. There's the violent criminals. There's the drug runners. There's all the stuff that Trump would emphasize in his campaign. But then there's also this enormous kind of probably majority of like just nondescript illegal immigrants who we don't know to have broken any other laws besides our border laws. And we've been saying it's going to be an optics challenge and a politics challenge once you start getting to that level, because you can shut down the border. Everyone's happy with that. You can clear out the violent criminals. Everyone's happy with that. Not clear where the electorate is going to come down when you start to clear out the rest of people who are here illegally. And I think like the massive hiring binge at ICE has not helped, because it's created, put a bunch of people on the streets that are maybe still finding their sea legs. And yeah, that leaving aside like whether Trump has a right to do this, whether ICE is, to be clear, perfectly legitimate for ICE to go into American cities and find and deport illegal immigrants. Like, that is a legitimate function of the government. It's ridiculous and deplorable the way these leftist politicians are portraying that as somehow illegitimate. But just speaking at a political level, which I think is the question you were asking, Ryan, like, it's a risk, it's a danger. Then, as you say, there's the response from an emboldened left who you only have to give them the slightest hint that they might be like gaining ground, and they instantly dial it up to 11, right? Which is an advantage for Trump. Like, this footage that has come out of this church, there's so many telling moments in it. My favorite part is where they say something like, you're Christians, aren't you supposed to welcome all immigrants? It's like you could not find a more perfect example of the Peachy Keenan, so you call yourself a Christian trope. Like, these are people who have no interest in Christianity, except insofar as they can use it in a hostage situation to get their way and to make people feel guilty. And I think that is also extremely unappealing to people. Again, leaving aside, it's probably, I think it's illegal as well to like storm a church, and there are going to be legal cases about this. But like, leaving that aside for a second, just talking about the politics, you've got this clueless buffoon, Don Lemon, like dressing up and with this sort of very sober look on his face. Like, this is what protest is all about. I mean, church is what the First Amendment is all about, right? The people in that church were exercising like 3 of their First Amendment rights to freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, arguably also freedom of expression. Like, so it's completely backwards and obviously just empty what Don Lemon is doing and what the protesters are doing. You ask, Ryan, like, which of these two things is gonna tip the scales at the midterms? Like, I don't know. I'm having a hard time telling. I think it might depend on some of this other stuff. Like, we've mentioned the foreign policy issues, and Trump seems to think that that's going to be one of his major achievements, is to kind of lay out all of these successes abroad by the time we get to November. But I don't know. Prices and ISIS are like two very powerful rhetorical weapons for the left. And I think if I were Trump, I might be thinking about how to like dial back some of the more hardcore immigration stuff, at least for now. But maybe that makes me a squish. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think a lot of it really does depend on, it's just far too early. I know some of the polling, doesn't look great. But at the same time, this is actually the anniversary of Trump taking office. So this is year 1. We just actually put up a piece by Naz Setman talking about what he's done in immigration, talking about what he's done at the DOJ, Harmeet Dillon, all the work that she's done at the Office of Civil Rights, even on immigration. I think they've deported about 600,000 immigrants, legal immigrants in 2025. And then a further estimated 2.5 million left America during that time. So they self-deported. They took, I guess, this offer of $1,000 to self-deport. And then another problem, too, which is, ICE having to go in these communities, especially hostile ones like Minneapolis. I mean, the reason why they have to do that is because these communities themselves declare themselves to be sanctuary cities. So that's why they actually have to go in and do some of these raids, and why it looks a little bit worse than I think it otherwise would. So this is really, look at Tim Walz, look at Jacob Frey, look at these people who are actually running this place. I mean, I would put the blame, mostly squarely on them. I understand the optics. I understand it may not look great. But at the same time, some of this, I think, is, just what normally is done with immigration enforcement. It's not always going to look, 100% pristine. It may not always help Trump for the election coming up, but especially with what the left just did in this church, City's Church in Minneapolis, I think that can only help Trump. You have, this famous image of, Democrats booing God. I think that was at the 2012 DNC. And now you have this where they completely contorted Christianity, the Constitution, to, basically break up a divine service on Sunday mornings. I mean, it couldn't look worse than that. I mean, you would have even a decent number, I would imagine, of even Democrats, independents, who would look at that and say, okay, that's a bridge too far. You just can't do that kind of thing. That's not America. And not to mention, I mean, just a straight violation of the FACE Act. Will Chamberlain on X kind of showed pieces of the U.S. Code, conspiracy against rights, damage to religious property, obstruction of persons in the free exercise of religious beliefs. So, I mean, the Department of Justice, Harmeet Dillon, is talking about, bringing charges against Lemon and some of these other provocateurs. And some of these people, I mean, are absolutely professional. Nakima Armstrong, I think, was, co-organized the protest. She used to be actually president of the NAACP in Minneapolis. William Kelly, he's a known kind of ringleader for mobs, both in Minneapolis, and he's, I guess, been doing that in another church, Christchurch in D.C. And actually, I think in Christchurch, D.C., he actually sent a church member to the hospital with a shattered eardrum. So, I mean, this kind of thing is happening. And then, too, these people are actually organizing like publicly on X, where I think the co-organizer, Armstrong, she actually had a post where she named herself and named everyone else who was going to be there, like just totally providing, an open lane for prosecution. So, I mean, Trump in some respects, I mean, has to be pretty glad with his enemies. But yeah, I would certainly say on the economy, things need to improve. Prices need to go down. There needs to be some kind of tangible result that he can tell people that, hey, you put me in office and this is what I've done for you for a vote. So I think it just so much depends on luck and strategy and whatever. But, Trump does tend to be pretty lucky. So we'll see what happens. But I wouldn't be surprised if maybe, it's not quite the wipeout that everybody thinks it might be.
Yeah, I wanted to point everyone to a provocative short essay from our friend and Salvatore Research Fellow in the American Founding, Glenn Elmers, a frequent and prolific faculty member at our summer fellowships and writer of books and all the rest. Go check out all of Glenn's stuff. But he wrote a piece for our chairman's website, tomklingenstein.com, called Trump Must Learn from Machiavelli. And he's talking about this situation with ICE in Minneapolis, but it could be applied more broadly too. And I just wanted to read a few paragraphs from this to provoke folks, to point them to it. Maybe we can chew it over just for a minute. Sort of middle of the beginning, Glenn writes, the anti-deportation protests comprise two very different elements, paid militants and deluded idealists, the latter including a disproportionate number of suburban white women. Just as an aside, I think it's pretty amusing that the New York Times seems to have just discovered the term awful, affluent white female liberal, and they're lamenting the deployment of it by the right. And some of our friends I've heard from who are sort of old Gen X or young boomers are saying, "Oh, do you know this term?" And I say, "Yeah,
do we know this term?
That term for years." Yeah,
I've heard of it. I mean, just as a point of order, I don't think we came up with that term. I don't think that was the right. That was the left criticizing the clueless white ladies that were needing to be called in or whatever. So it's like, don't put that on us.
Yeah, Glenn continues, what drives these well-educated, relatively affluent wives and mothers to defend even the worst among the illegal aliens, including lethal drunk drivers, child abusers, and sex traffickers? The answer shows that we are long past ordinary partisan differences. This is a civilizational crisis. Friedrich Nietzsche anticipated this phenomenon more than a century ago. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, there is a point in the history of society when it becomes so pathologically soft and tender that, among other things, it sides even with those who harm it, criminals, and does this quite seriously and honestly. Punishing somehow seems unfair to it, and it is certain that imagining punishment and being supposed to punish hurts it, arouses fear in it. Is it not enough to render him undangerous? Why still punish? Punishing itself is terrible. With this question, herd morality, the morality of timidity, draws its ultimate consequence, which leads, of course, naturally, Glenn to go from Nietzsche to Machiavelli, to put an even more a finer and more controversial point on all this. This puts Trump in a tight spot, writes Glenn. Nietzsche's great teacher, Niccolo Machiavelli, who more than any other figure in history investigated political extremism and showed what extreme circumstances demand, would sympathize with Trump's predicament. The pathological softness that Nietzsche describes was already evident to Machiavelli in 16th century Florence. Skipping ahead a bit. From Machiavelli's perspective, Trump is courting catastrophe by trying to steer an impossible middle course, a common error for most politicians. Trump has excited and animated his enemies without making them fear him. Machiavelli would say that this error comes from trying to be bold, but not being bold enough. Trump's enemies call him a fascist and deride ICE agents as Gestapo troops, knowing that this charge is entirely performative. Trump recognizes that the country is facing a critical inflection point. If we don't deport Biden's army of invaders now, we never will. Trump sees this, yet his attachment to the ordinary expectations of Republican principles and the rule of law restrains him from doing what is required. He is unwilling to be what Machiavelli called wholly bad. And then the final Machiavelli quote, just because they're always fun and pregnant with meaning. It very rarely happens, the Florentine tells us, that a bad man will use his power for good ends. But it is just as rare for a good man to embrace bad ways, even though his end be good. Now, I would say that I think Glenn is using wholly bad here to illustrate what Trump's enemies and critics will think of him. We certainly don't think that a vigorous enforcement of immigration policy or even the Insurrection Act in light of this obstinate and lawless opposition at many levels in Minneapolis is wholly bad. It's actually unconstitutional in many ways. But a fun and provocative piece from Glenn, so go check it out. Trump Must Learn from Machiavelli at tomklingenstein.com. Any thoughts, gentlemen and scholars?
Yeah, it's clearly, there's something that's clearly right there about if you're going to do it, right? And this is probably not in addition to what Glenn is saying, but I think that the like other calculation here is the time dimension, right? So if Glenn is right that Trump is, I think it's certainly true that Trump is within his rights to deport any illegal alien. That seems axiomatic to me. But and so it's probably true what Glenn says, that if he's going to go maximalist, he shouldn't go 3/4 of the way. And the reason I ask about timing is because, Ryan, you sort of introduced this in the context of the impending midterms. And one reality of Republican politics that Trump is highly attuned to is electoral politics. So, like, if the badness that we're talking about is perceived badness in the eyes of the electorate, then that is also a factor in when to go full deportation.
And I think another part of this too is, does Trump himself, does he know actually how to be even like wholly bad? Is that even his view? I just think about foreign policy, where I think sometimes some more hardcore MAGA people, even among some people I know, scholars, etc., who are surprised that he's not more kind of like John Quincy Adams, circa, we'll not go in search of monsters to destroy that idea. And so they're kind of put off by some of what they see as like interventionism. But their view really wasn't, there's obviously some connection to what Trump is, but Trump was always a little more hawkish than I think some of his, even big supporters want him to be. So I would just wonder if this is just an overall issue where he maybe doesn't know how to be wholly bad, in the most Republican way. I'm just not sure he actually even perceives that or understands that possibly. And that's why that Trump really is the guy who crashes down the gate, gets in, starts to build a foundation. But this is a movement that's going to go on for, decades and decades to come. I mean, this is only the start.
Yeah. And if the Republicans lose the House, Trump will still be able to enforce federal law as the commander-in-chief and the one who takes the oath to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And with the big, beautiful bills considerably ramped up funding for ICE, they continue to hire more people. Recruiting is up. So their manpower problem will become less of an issue. I think they have, a couple thousand ICE agents in Minneapolis and maybe 30,000 overall, and you have a population of illegal immigrants. If you're just taking the criminals in the several millions, I suspect, serious criminals, most illegals are criminals just by the fact of coming here illegally, but that's a separate question from the more violent and disruptive part of that class. So the midterms would be a problem for Trump, but it wouldn't be an insurmountable problem in continuing to do deportation, although you will quickly be mired in, if the Democrats take the House, endless investigations, another impeachment to be sure, and all the rest. And then if the real existential threat, I think, for immigration patriots and people like us who are concerned with the rapid influx of illegal immigrants through the Biden years, on top of what's been a few decade sustained influx of illegal immigrants. If you lose the presidency in 2028, the Democrats will just reverse all of this and the gates will be back open. And they will seek, if they have a big enough majority in the House, the Senate is going to be harder for them to take. They will try quickly to make as many of these recent immigrants, illegal or otherwise, citizens, and thus electorally swamp their opposition party. I think they've been quite clear about that being their plan. So the stakes are high and the time is short. That's the backdrop for all of this. And Glenn lays that out nicely in his setup for this interesting reflection on the pathologies of a soft democratic people over time, grown decadent and comfortable. Which brings us to foreign policy. The question of Greenland, much in the news this week as the World Economic Forum is taking place and Trump is in Europe. This is just from a Wall Street Journal kind of reported piece on this. I think they're not incorrect to call it perhaps the deepest crisis for NATO since World War II. Taking Trump's bluster and threats over Greenland and coupling them with the prospect of a renewed trade war with Europe over this issue and the recalcitrance and seeming united front across the pond on this issue. Even Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform UK, thinks that Trump is making an unforced error here. The article in the Wall Street Journal quotes Doug Lute, who's a retired U.S. Army lieutenant general, and a former U.S. ambassador to NATO. And he says the following, which I think is probably correct. But the causes of it, I think I might dispute with Mr. Lute. He says the organization will survive, that is NATO, but the trust, the glue that has held it together for over 75 years has been shattered, so it will not be effective. And I think this raises the larger issue of something
you can't shatter glue.
I know.
Use your metaphors correctly.
Right.
No, no. I know that's not the larger issue. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
go on.
It's been dissolved, made weaker, but not shattered.
Yes,
well, maybe if the glue was in Greenland long enough and frozen, Spencer, that we could shatter it.
There we go.
But I think this is the Ukraine-Russia issue has forced this. I mean, Trump demanding higher contributions from NATO in his first term, and now getting them some in his first term and into his second term. These are all parts of this larger problem of NATO, which is someone was writing in the Spectator US, forgive me, dear author, I forget who you are, but a Brit who was saying, Trump is the accelerant of this NATO crisis, but he's not the cause of it. I mean, what always held NATO together was a common threat, whether from the Soviet Union or in the early years from the prospects of a rearmed, or not rearmed, but the prospect of a Germany feeling its national identity again, something that NATO has always tried to keep down. What's the old semi-aphorism? NATO's purpose is to keep the Russians out and the Germans down. There might be a third to that tripartite, but I don't remember it. But it's illustrative enough. And NATO, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union and its expansion, which many call somewhat reckless, into the Baltics and Russia's doorstep, was part of what precipitated Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, the prospect of Ukrainian admission into NATO. Anyway, long story short, this, I think, is a symptom. Trump is forcing the issue that has been developing, which is to say, especially with the revival of a kind of nationalist, populist, and I would argue constitutionalist and more foreign policy restrained or realistic, not to say realist, foreign policy approach from the now two Trump administrations. This was always going to be on a collision course with the much more internationalist, bureaucratized, in some ways anti-sovereigntist bent of at least a lot of the NATO members, especially in Western Europe. So you can the clerisy that, or a portion of the clerisy, maybe especially the non-military and the bureaucratic side of NATO in recent decades, is pretty opposed to the revival of American nationalism and a recalibration of America as the world's policeman. So this Greenland thing is just tearing open that wound. I don't know, it doesn't poll that well, I must say. We talked about polls on the economy and ICE. Greenland looks to be a pretty bad issue for Trump. So I'm not sure how this is all going to play out. The American people, I think to the tune of about 60%, don't really think this is a great way of going about things. And I'll just finish by saying it is also true that Greenland is a strategic problem as it's currently constituted for the United States, because Denmark really can't govern it and defend it without U.S. help. Greenland itself, if it were to go independent, is not really sovereign in any real sense. I mean, it's 60,000 people in the middle of the North Atlantic. The notion that they could defend themselves without being a protectorate of the U.S. and Europe, either combined or separate, is laughable. So you can understand why Trump thinks it's a big deal and why he's being maybe more belligerent than some think is warranted. And then, of course, you have China and Russia's interest in in Greenland or anything like Greenland, especially as it might be a counterbalance or a strategic and geographic counterbalance to the United States. So again, the stakes are high with the Greenland question. I don't know how this is all going to shake out. Maybe Trump's art of the deal will triumph once again, and he'll back off from his maximalist position of us having to have it, and we'll have a revamped agreement with Greenland to have an expanded U.S. presence there and more basing rights and more dependence on the U.S. as opposed to Denmark. We'll see.
Yeah, my guess is I think you're right, because Trump usually stakes out some kind of maximalist position and then actually pulls back to, I think, what he's actually interested in. But I think part of the problem with the administration is, I mean, I have not seen really a coherent case really presented for this. It just seems like, the liberals or the left is right. Trump is this authoritarian. He just has global ambitions, even beyond the Western Hemisphere. But I think there's a lot of strategic reasons as to why he's actually interested in Greenland. I mean, for missile defense, nuclear triad staging, so this helps reduce reliance on third parties, for like subdocking, shipping lane dominance, minerals, and it just goes on and on and on. So I think that there's many, many reasons why the U.S. would be very interested. And I was also reading actually a couple of Wall Street Journal articles too about this. And one thing was curious. In one of them, they said, American national security specialists say that Russia and China pose no near-term threat to Greenland. The U.S. has a broad freedom to establish defenses on the island under 1951 Pact with Denmark. Russia and China pose no near-term threat. I think that's interesting because there's actually a Reuters column I looked up from 2022, which said Russia's bases inside the Arctic Circle outnumber NATO's by about a third. according to data compiled by the International Institute for Strategic Studies and Reuters, Russia now has 11 submarines capable of launching long-range nuclear weapons for use in an all-out nuclear war, 8 of them based in the Arctic Kola Peninsula, according to the IISS. NATO has 22 between the United States, France, and the UK. So I think there's some basic issues, and this is 2022. So this was, now, 4 years ago. So I think that there are a lot of strategic reasons as to why we're doing this. And again, for some reason, I think a lot of that just isn't being really spelled out. And actually, a guy who really did spell that out is Thomas Dan. So there's a really good Financial Times piece. There's actually a link to Real Clear Politics this morning. And he, I think, says basically what's going on. He says, so Dan's is a Trump appointee who heads the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, which is an advisory body. And he says, Greenland is the front door for hemispheric defense. It's not just the ice melting, but also the idea that you can rely on a small country on the other side of the world to provide security for the front door of America. There's way too much risk for us. It may sound like American chauvinism, and it is. We're not apologizing about that. There's no other country that can provide safety for America that America can't provide itself. So I think this is all part of a larger shift and a recognition of, NATO and all the alliances and the systems and the apparatuses that were really developed for the Cold War era, and then kind of obviously kept going after, the short-term post-Cold War era. I mean, we live in a different, multipolar world. And so that's going to mean that the U.S. is going to have to take up more of its defenses itself. So I think that's all part of a much larger recognition of circumstances have changed. These alliances, these international bodies, I mean, these were never permanent. They were always connected to real material problems that are totally different. And I think the Trump administration is recognizing that, that's a separate question of whether what they're doing right now from disengaging and decoupling is the right strategy. But I think overall, in principle, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that you guys are both articulating that NATO is functionally already kind of bent out of shape seems right to me and seems consistent with everything else, with the Trump administration's general posture toward Europe. And I guess, the classical precedent that people invoke most often for NATO is the Delian League, this post-Persian War sort of assemblage of states, supremacy by invitation, as I've heard it called, and this idea that the city-states basically band together around Athens, and Athens is technically first among equals, but eventually becomes a hegemon and abuses its power, and the breakdown of all this is part of the lead up to the Peloponnesian War. And so if that's at least a good rough analog, then I would think our objective here should be navigating the disentanglement of NATO without a war. If we are saying basically that Trump is not to blame for ending NATO, NATO is on a path toward extinction and doesn't really make all that much sense as presently constituted anyway, then Trump's aim should be, and probably is, to kind of renegotiate a different deal with our allies, or a different balance of power that keeps America at the front, but no longer has these weird, vestigial, anachronistic holdovers about that are products of the Cold War and the Second World War, right? What Ryan was indicating about keeping Germany down. It's at this point, Germany is, would roll over if we so much as said boo. It's please, let me give you my house. And so that just doesn't. That I'm with you guys. That doesn't make a ton of sense. I also think that the first Trump goes maximalist, then he walks it back model is clearly what's going on here. He's trying to now kind of shift in the direction of tariffs. It looks like maybe this is about an economic deal. Maybe this is about really forcefully putting into action some of the possibilities of our current deal, more bases there, whatever. But yeah, I just don't know what, if NATO's going to break, is Greenland what we want to break it over. It is part of our hemisphere, and we're doing a lot in the the southern part of our Western hemisphere to shore up our interests. And the picture there is clear. The picture with Greenland is not. And yeah, my worry is that this is a kind of hobby horse of Trump's that is more trouble than it's worth, especially in an election year.
Yeah. I suspect that this week, I hope this week may offer some clarity on this issue as they all interact together and have their dinners and backroom meetings, and maybe cooler heads will prevail, and Trump will get walked off the ledge, and we'll find some face-saving way for both parties to de-escalate a bit. I don't think it will break NATO, but partly because I don't think, the certain NATO members, sending a nominal set of troops to Greenland. I think it seems that they had this exercise plan beforehand anyway, but a U.S. invasion is not imminent nor likely to happen at all. So that issue wouldn't be forced, which would break NATO, I should think. So I think they'll find some other way to resolve this, and I hope they do. This brings us to our closing segment before some recommendations, which is we just wanted to flag a phenomenon which Spencer knows well and has written about and has been growing, and the occasion for our discussion of it, one among a few occasions or reasons, is Spencer has reviewed Curtis Dozer's, he's an academic, book, The White Pedestal, which is about my jokey title for this segment was The Unbearable Whiteness of Being. But it's about how the classics, and this was kicked off actually by Professor Zuckerberg, Mark Zuckerberg's sister, right, Spencer, a few years back. This is a growing obsession of the left and the academic left, which is that they're quite alarmed that certain portions of the right and the online alt-right are looking to antiquity as some sort of model of manliness or martial virtues or civilizational pride or whatever, take your pick. And this has led the academic left to turn on the classics and to turn on ancient civilization as somehow irredeemably. It's totally anachronistic to talk this way, but I'm just using their terms. The ancient world is irredeemably, racist, xenophobic, and patriarchal and misogynist, among other things. It also comes. We were talking about this the other day, and Spencer mentioned, it comes with folks like some very prominent academics from all over prominent academia, and not just Harvard, but Jim Hankins, CRB contributor, has left Harvard for the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida, along with quite a few other historians, among others, who are fleeing the normal prestige academy for this state school, admittedly a good state school with a good reputation, down in Gainesville, Florida, and this new center there. I think the Hankins reports they've hired 28 new faculty members in recent months and over the last year. And Hankins wrote a piece for Compact on why he was leaving academia, and it's not really about he touches on the degradation of classics departments and actually the offloading of the study of ancient history to classics departments, among one of the many reasons that he decided to leave Harvard, but main reason being the kind of illiberal and ideologically conformist and uninteresting evolution of faculty at Harvard and their hiring practices, which since 2020 have more or less been a sign on the door that says, white men need not apply. Jim Hankins, being a white man of good standing for a long time, a senior scholar in his own right, decided he'd had enough.
Adoringly white man, yes.
Right. Excruciatingly white and excruciatingly male. Spencer, you want to talk just a little bit about this in the larger context of this, both the decline of the serious study of classics, but also this ideological turn in a in a genre or subfield of academia that you thought would have been content to just tend its own garden and continue to appreciate great old books and literature? But what's going on?
Would that it could be so. Yeah, I think this is kind of interesting. Like Curtis Dozier's book, The White Pedestal, would really not be worth paying much attention to at all. It's not a seriously argued or composed piece of scholarship, but it does have this one kind of intriguing feature, which is that it makes explicit a shift in strategy that's been going on for some time, at least since Not All Dead White Men, which is Donna Zuckerberg's book that you alluded to, Ryan.
Yeah.
But really earlier than that, since kind of the 2010s is when this became a major strain, or when this strain came out in the open. And it goes kind of something like this, right? As you say, not just neo-Nazis, not just skinheads, but right-wingers in general, and indeed people of all political persuasions who have a certain healthy filial piety and love of country and of home, are often keen to invoke the classics, Greco-Roman antiquity especially, but also more broadly the kind of Athens and Jerusalem model of the West, as a kind of paradigm to look to the great men and deeds and texts of the past and draw from them lessons for the present, which is an extremely normal, in fact, you would even say ubiquitous human impulse. In the West, we do this with Athens and Jerusalem. You know, if we were Indians, we might turn to Sanskrit, classical Sanskrit literature. But since we're not, we don't, at least not primarily, much as we might find wisdom in those other texts as well. This phenomenon is alarming to a certain breed of academic and intellectual who are inclined to see nothing but retrograde evil in the love of country and patriotism. And so for a while, the argument was these guys who are trying to be like the Spartans at Thermopylae, who are trying to lionize the Roman Empire, right? These are all brain dead fascists. These are drooling idiots who don't understand the first thing about classical antiquity and have never actually read Herodotus. They've just seen Zack Snyder's 300. And a lot of the pieces and books that came out in this vein made that argument. We are the real scholars. We who know that there was nothing all that glorious about the past. You know, let us show you how you have misread the sources. There was a problem with this, which is that it's not only brain-dead, slack-jawed neo-Nazis who like to read the classics and learn from them. It's also some quite intelligent and sophisticated and erudite readers of texts who nevertheless find something worthwhile in classical antiquity. And sometimes they give very faithful readings of Herodotus and Thucydides and still come away feeling like, you know, the West is something worth talking about and preserving, even celebrating. And so since it wasn't always possible to refute the, shall we say, more conservative side of classics, the leftists who took this tack kind of pivoted to saying, actually, it is the ancients who are the problem. That is, the fascists who read Aristotle are right to do so because Aristotle is a fascist or a proto-fascist, or there are kind of seeds, germs of all kinds of nasty isms in the classics themselves, which amounts basically to pushing the self-destruct button on the discipline. Because the idea of classics is not just that these are kind of among the more interesting texts we might study, but that they have some special weight and worth that would merit devoting academic resources, attention, care, and study to them. And so the White Pedestal ends up arguing that what we need to do is resist and subvert the processes that created classics as a discipline in the first place, and ultimately probably dismantle the whole notion that there's something interesting or important about ancient Greece and Rome beyond any other ancient civilization. We might as well study the Babylonians for all that it matters. And this is of a piece with, say, Dan L. Padilla Peralta is another big name in this in this area. They all love Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey and the Iliad, which I've also reviewed and I don't think is very good, but that's sort of beside the point. Except that this is the coterie that we're talking about, and I think what's kind of fascinating about this is either we are interested in the study of literature because we enjoy kind of cataloging and interrogating magpie-like random facts about the past, or we think that there are some virtues and forms of human excellence that endure throughout time, and we're concerned to preserve and cherish and indeed seek out the best that has been thought and said. And so I think what's happening now is that like those two things can't both be true. And those two visions of education are kind of crystallizing into two almost separate streams of scholarship and separate visions of the university. And guys like Hankins, who is by no means a hard right winger, I'm not even sure what he would call himself politically, but he's an extraordinarily literate and well-read historian with no illusions about the ugly parts of the past, who nevertheless thinks that what we ought to be doing is studying the history of the West and trying to take that as a model, the best of the history of the West as a model and a rule book and an instruction manual for our own lives. It's either that or deconstruction forever. And I think like those are kind of the two educational models that are increasingly on offer. And it will be really interesting to see, like, a lot of the prestige lives at these institutions that have been basically taken over by deconstructionists. But a lot of the horsepower, the intellectual horsepower, is kind of draining away from those institutions in the person of guys like Hankins, toward like an attempts to kind of revive and revitalize the liberal arts and the classics and Western Civ in a variety of alternative institutions. And I think like we all have a kind of investment in which one of those two visions for the country's education system wins out. Obviously, which side I'm on. But just as a kind of drama in itself, it's like fascinating to watch it unfold.
And this is really comes to mind actually a bunch of different things to maybe even help explain it. Just like with Strauss, the dichotomy between, say, natural right and historicism. You have one side, there are no kind of trans-political truths. Well, except the truth that white people are evil at all times, in all places. So there's that kind of interesting, chink in the armor there. But also, too, kind of come to mind like the difference between, say, Woodrow Wilson and FDR, like Dozier's kind of like Wilson, where he's just very open about his rejection of, say, the principles of the founding. But then you have, another situation I don't think we've talked about where, Plato supposedly, is, conservatives are trying to kind of stop him from being taught at Texas A&M, and these professors are lashing out. And then you have, I think, Greg Lukianoff of Fire, kind of coming to their defense. And Jeremy Carl actually wrote about this in his Substack. What's actually going down is just playing basically games in the media to try to kind of drum up publicity, paint, especially Texas legislators, I'm sure, easy targets, as bad guys, as, Neanderthals, etc. And it's just kind of this like dishonest, kind of disingenuous, kind of cynical effort to kind of hype up these issues. But what's actually happening is totally different. Like, we are actually wanting to, and I think the people that are, that we stand for, and certainly what Claremont represents, is the recitation, lifting up this stuff. I mean, to taking people as they understood themselves, taking that seriously, taking education as once understood seriously, because it directly goes into how we form citizens, how we form people. I mean, this is not just kind of free-floating abstract thoughts. I mean, this has real-life consequences as well. Yes, you can be a philosopher on the mountain forever and stay up there, but, Jesus came down from the mountain after the transfiguration, right? So you go back to the city and you help uplift in that way. So this is of prime importance, especially to us as Republican citizens in America, what the state of our education is, and how it can be used to improve minds, but obviously improve the polity as well.
Yeah, you would think that a certain segment of our ideological adversaries, especially in the academy, who fancy themselves students of history and political scientists, even, I'm not talking about Dozier, but others who are allegedly concerned about the state of American democracy and Trump's erosion of the separation of powers, you think one of their bulwarks would be, on their own terms, or should be, some of the architects of our system of government. And those who've studied this know, I mean, Madison famously, in preparation for Constitution building and for the Federalist Papers and all the rest, went back to antiquity to make a 6-week or whatever it was study in the months leading up to the convention, a study of the ancient republics and what pitfalls they faced and what were their undoing. But all of this rich history and history of America, especially, seems to not really concern these folks. It's, I think there you touched on it, Mike. They're all implicit, if not explicit, historicists in a certain way, even if they don't know it, in that they think somehow democracy, at least if you keep it out of the hands of someone like Trump, will go on forever, no matter what sort of evolution, ideological or institutional evolutions you inflict upon it in the 250 years since the founding of America, the Declaration, or take your inflection point. So it all seems remarkably, I guess, sophomoric in a way, and unserious. But that has been the case in the academy for many years now, so we shouldn't be surprised. Anyway, something to watch. My hope would be that these reforming institutions outside of the normal Ivies will continue to discredit the Ivies as the good people continue to leave the Ivies. I think that would be a healthy development for American small r republicanism and definitely in American education. And you couple that with the resurgence of, or the growing popularity of homeschooling and classical schooling and growing school choice and educational accounts and all the rest, as people try to reform our K through 12 education system from the ground up with a refocusing on the, you can look at a lot of these classical schools of various stripes, whether they be charter or private, and they're doubling down on serious study of the great works of the West, which includes antiquity. So maybe the Doziers of this world will continue to recede into irrelevance with the growth of alternatives and I think what should be demonstrable to anyone who takes education seriously or their children's education seriously, which is the rejection of this cramped and ideological notion about the ancient world and its literature and great works. The rejection of that is where excellence lies for your children and for the future. And I'll just, one last thing, touching on a theme I think we hit weeks and weeks, if not months and months ago. Our colleague Chris Caldwell and others have written, and that was sort of the theme of my speech at NatCon, with the rise of AI and the rise of plagiarism and AI-created work and the continued sort of semi-illiteracy of students who aren't serious, many of whom are matriculating into the old institutions of higher education. If you can really give your child a wonderfully rounded in many ways, classical education, I suspect, especially if they're pretty intelligent, that they'll have a leg up on most of their peers as they move into our AI and our increasingly AI-influenced world. And they'll be the ones equipped to help us morally and intellectually navigate this new world. So double down on the classics with us. It will be good for you and your posterity. We're pretty much at the end of our time, but we wanted a few quick cultural recommendations. I'll kick us off. I told the gents earlier this week, or maybe even last week, I think on Monday, we talked about it. We're reading Lord of the Rings for our 7-year-old, just turned 7, our boy. And so I decided I have not read it in a long time. I think it's probably been 20 years or so. But there's this, it's less popular because it's been out for not as long. And by popular, I just mean it has the small amount of ratings, meaning just the 6,000 or so instead of 50,000 on Audible, which is Andy Serkis's reading of The Lord of the Rings. Serkis is a wonderful voice actor who voiced Gollum for the movies. And I've been enjoying his, I'm, a third of the way through Fellowship of the Ring, and it's wonderful. So if you're a fan of Tolkien, this Serkis, that is Serkis, not circus like Big Top, reading of it is quite good. And your kids will love it, but you must do what we have vowed to do, which is read it to them first yourselves. Then maybe you can listen to it. And the enduring wisdom of Tolkien, moral and intellectual and otherwise, can sink in on a second listening to the delight of your children.
Well, since we did a classics segment to close out, I feel at least somewhat justified in not trying to pull out of pop culture references. I usually do with limited success at this point in the show. But I am currently teaching some selections from the Old Testament as part of a survey course involving a variety of wisdom literature, which has been a true delight. I taught Ecclesiastes this morning, and we've been kind of going through a sequence that begins with Proverbs, runs through Job, and ends up in Ecclesiastes, kind of progressively challenging assertions of futility and meaningless in various realms of life, answered by increasingly profound kind of meditations on theodicy and the divine providence. So just like endlessly rich texts in and of themselves. But if you have an interest in the Old Testament, which you should, irrespective of your religious background, I wanted to recommend a resource that I have loved for many years, and it's called Sepharia.org, Sefaria.org. And this is a big interactive compendium of Jewish commentary on the Hebrew Bible, on the Old Testament. So basically, click on any chapter and it'll give you a kind of an interlinear English and Hebrew. So you can read the chapter, and then any verse, you can just click on that and it will compile for you a bunch of different commentators and what they've said about this particular verse. So if you're ever just puzzling over something, I mean, it's fun to kind of explore what sorts of interpretations you can draw out of the text on your own. But if you just want a choice selection of really helpful insights into the text, some of them haven't been translated, so you'll have to only use them if you read Hebrew, but a lot of them come with translations, and especially Rashi, the medieval rabbi and commentator, and Rambam, or Maimonides, though he's called Rambam on Sepharia, just always have something useful to say. Even if you don't end up agreeing with their interpretation, they give you something that is like a foothold, like a plausible foothold for you to kind of work with and chew over. So they have an app. The website is quite beautifully done, and it's just a great companion to basically any book of the Old Testament.
Well, if you're a fan of PBS Masterpiece Theater, I think the new season of All Creatures Great and Small is on. So my wife and I we just started season 4. We're just trying to catch up, but it's a fantastic show about a veterinary practice in England, kind of rural England, during the midst of World War II. And the characters are great. The acting's fantastic. The scenery is beautiful. So if you have not watched that show, I would highly, highly recommend it. And just a lot of Masterpiece shows too. It just seems like that they're kind of the place to go for just really good quality television, very well made, very well acted. I would highly recommend a lot of their shows.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Spencer. And thank you all once again for listening and viewing the Roundtable. If you'd like to learn more about our work, go to Claremont.org. If you'd like to support our work, Claremont.org/donate. Of course, as always, go check out our publications at AmericanMind.org and ClaremontReviewBooks.com. 25th anniversary double issue is still up and out, and it's long, so you can peruse it, I think, for the coming couple of months as we prepare the spring issue of the Claremont Review Books. Of course, check out our latest at the DC Center at dc.claremont.org, and please rate, review the show, share it with all your friends, YouTube, podcasts, wherever. And I want to thank our engineering and production crew, the brothers Gannon, Ryan, and Jake, but also Logan Zeppieri, who stood in this week because our dear engineer producer Ryan is getting married. So he's out of the office this week. Congratulations and best wishes to Ryan and his bride-to-be. And thank you all for listening and watching. We will talk to you next week.